Are we ready to go? Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Mackler with Jim Lafferty this evening on Thursday, a few days before the election. I'm the National Secretary of the political party Socialist Action and its candidate for the US presidency. I promised Jim that if I win the election on Tuesday, he has a job as Attorney General of the United States as we work together in transition to a just society. Meanwhile, I'm proud to be with Jim Lafferty tonight. Jim was until recently, the executive director for 30 some odd years of the National Lawyers Guild chapter in Los Angeles. He is the long-term and current host of a KPFK Pacifica radio station program, the Lawyers Guild, which is a weekly public affairs program. He has served as a national leader of the anti-war movement in different capacities through different United Front mobilizations for, as we were chatting before the meeting, some 60 years, which means at one time, Jim Lafferty, you were in your 20s and your law firm in Detroit with a whole bunch of friends of mine in the 60s represented just about every single left group and good cause. You are a central leader of the NPAC, National Peace Action Coalition, which mobilized literally millions of people against the war in Vietnam. And since then, you have been consistent in mobilizing against every US interventionist war. But today, here we are having a crazy discussion. I'm asking you a question which most listeners would think is literally insane. Are we seriously dealing with a threat by the President of the United States to illegally, in violation of the Constitution, declare himself president without counting literally millions of votes on election eve? Is that a fantasy? And is it also a possibility that the president says, in the event that there are massive mobilizations to protest his declaration that he is the king of the United States, if people protest too virulently, he will call in federal troops to crush us? Is this an insane proposition? What are we dealing with today, Jim Lafferty?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for this opportunity to join you and for that overly kind introduction. And it's all mutual. We could go on talking about the work we've had the pleasure of doing together and separately for many years. Yeah, and you're quite right. Even for longtime socialists and activists such as ourselves, it's some mornings hard for me to get my mind around the fact that, yes, Trump is definitely determined by hook or crook, and I do mean by hook or crook, to not leave the White House for the next 4 years and to become the autocratic ruler of the country, if you will. And that's just not something that those of us on the left are shouting about in some kind of hysterical way. Anybody who's been reading responsible mainstream media newspapers, the LA Times, the Washington Post, you name it, understands how real a threat this is. Constitutional scholars from one end of the country to the other have in fact outlined the many options available to Trump if, as we believe and we take him at his word, and we should, he tries to effectuate a coup. And let me just, if I may, tick off a few of those to get us going. First of all, there are 300 lawsuits pending as we speak. They're in largely the federal courts. The federal courts are a majority in the control of the Republican Party and very right-wing Republicans. The same thing, of course, is true at the end of that legal food chain, the Supreme Court, even more so now with the latest appointment. So you have, and most of these cases are being lost. What are they about? They're about the gerrymandering that's going on. They're about the Jim Crow laws. They're about the purging of who knows how many millions of legitimate eligible voters from the voting registration rolls in state after state after state. They're about money and pot. They're about lots of things, and they're also about the fact that because we have such an outpouring of votes this time, and because of the pandemic, so many of them will naturally be done through the mail and have been done through the mail. You have the very real likelihood, as evidenced by one of the Supreme Court opinions a few days ago in Wisconsin, of actually terminating the vote counting by the courts before, in fact, all the votes have been counted, even though they've been legitimately filed before Election Day. So there's just an array of ways in which this would all go south. And at the end of that road of ways it can all go south, if this ends up in the Congress, that means it ends up in the House of Representatives, where how many electoral votes there are from each state at that point are not determined by the vote totals, we don't even have them, but are determined rather by what the head of each delegation in the House says is the electoral vote. And there are more Republican-controlled House delegations from the states than there are Democratic, even though there's far more Democratic votes and far more representatives who are Democratic in the House. So there's any number of ways that I've outlined briefly that this election can be stolen when you've got a president who wants to do it, an attorney general who wants to do it, and a party that has bought into the notion that now that push has come to shove, they just as soon have an autocracy. I can't hear you, Jeff.
When a reporter at a major press conference queried the president of the United States whether or not, if he loses the election on Tuesday night, he will peacefully retire from the presidency in a constitutional manner. And Trump's answer to that was no. His answer was, I think these mail-in ballots, and some 70 million have been cast to date, are illegal. And I don't agree with them. And that's about it. He basically left open the question that he could unilaterally on election day reject the results of the election. We're all, going to be watching, and as we have for a lifetime, if for no other reason, a curiosity how the election results come in. And we all pretty much, most of the time, get an idea of who's winning. Every once in a while, like in 1960, it was so close that they had to go to the Supreme Court to discuss the 527 votes in Florida and the hanging chads. But aside from that, we pretty much know who's president when we wake up in the morning. And Trump is saying, yes, you will know who's president, because I don't think that these millions of mail ballots are valid. So can you imagine the scene? Here we are all watching television, 7 major stations counting the votes with their charts and graphs, and the president of the United States sitting in the White House with his own charts and graphs, announcing that he's president when no one else has figures that confirm that. And then he says, when asked, well, what are you going to do if there are mass protests? And he basically said and repeated, as he did a couple of months ago when he called out the troops to smash the demonstrations in Washington, D.C., that were 99.9999% peaceful. According to his own staff, he threatened to call in federal troops to put down mass protests. So let me explain to our audience for a minute. The president, the head executive director of the AFL-CIO, Rich Trumka, called a meeting of the AFL-CIO to discuss what to do if the president refused to abide by the election results. An embarrassed Trumka backed off when many unions said they'd come, but the Rochester Labor Council has said, we call for the AFL-CIO to call a general strike if Trump doesn't respect the elections, followed by the Troy Labor Council and the Washington State Labor Council and the Longshore locals, and literally hundreds, if not 1,000 organizations say that if the president does not respect the election results, they'll be in the streets on November 4th. Is that a possibility? Can you imagine the president calling in troops, young people from all over, to put down mass protests? Can you
Absolutely.
imagine these protests taking place?
Absolutely. I mean, we saw him do that in Portland and elsewhere in Seattle. I mean, he absolutely will he do that. And what's equally alarming is not only will he be willing to pull in federal troops, but you've also got, and I refer here to our listeners, they might want to check the Atlantic magazine. They can still find it online. I think it was the September issue of it, where an article by Giglio, by Giglio said, and the title of the article says it all: right-wing militias are bracing for civil war. Pro-Trump group has recruited thousands of police, soldiers, and veterans. And notice he didn't say former police and former soldiers. Another study that was done by it's got one of those long fancy names, but it's the National Academy of Sciences, basically, nonpartisan group, reported a study. This was on September 15th, in which the study showed that 50% of Republicans, we're not talking about paramilitary folks, 50% of Republicans felt that the traditional way of American life was disappearing to such an extent that they might have to use force to defend it. So you're going to have in the streets, hopefully, and we'll talk about that in a minute, millions of us who want to cling to that little piece of democracy that's still left in this country. But we've got to be realizing that Trump is not only going to have federal troops that he's going to be willing to use, but he's got paramilitary troops and all sorts of other groups well armed now, and as they showed during many of the Black Lives Matter marches, prepared to come out and use those weapons even. Can't hear you, Jeff.
During those Black Lives Matter protests, the estimates of the turnout ranged from 15 to 26 million people. That would make them the largest protests in the history of the United States. CNN did a poll as to what the opinions of the majority of the American people were, and they said that 84% of the American people supported those protests as legitimate expressions of mass opposition to what everybody now calls systemic racism in the United States. That's an admission that I haven't seen in one lifetime, not to mention demonstrations in 2,000 plus cities of 16 million people. I am only guessing that those demonstrations will be dwarfed by the numbers in the streets should he, on election night, without counting tens of millions of votes, declare himself the president. I think they will dwarf anything that these right-wing militias can do. I think the mass sentiment out there is for democratic rights in the country. And as a socialist, of course, and as presidential candidate, I don't support either political party, Democrat or Republican. But that's a secondary question to the eventuality of the President of the United States unilaterally declaring himself president in the absence of counting the votes. I think it's incumbent on all of us to get out in the streets in the tens, if not 100 million people, to say you just can't do this in the United States. Yes, you're right. As twisted and distorted as the elections are, it's a contest between billionaires. As you said, millions have been disenfranchised because of gerrymandering and other stuff. Nevertheless, it's a fundamental element in the minds of the people that they have a right to choose their president, regardless of the nature of the electoral system. Most people believe in it. And that belief in fundamental democratic rights, like opposition to systemic racism, I think is at the heart and soul of the ideas of the American people. It's incumbent on us to join these mobilizations and say no to this coup.
You're absolutely right, and that's the message I've been trying to get. I know you have too. And you mentioned earlier some of the unions that are already out there. I'm hearing now and seeing on my email inbox now announcements from groups, in many cases I've never heard of, and I'm fairly well in touch with, as you are. I think you and I mentioned that the other day, that groups we never heard of that are mobilizing, organizing. Just yesterday here in Los Angeles, the UTLA, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, which is, a good union, but it's not, they're mobilizing. They're calling for the teachers and students to be out in the streets. We know Black Lives Matter. Well, I am hopeful, partly because of how many people have shown their interest in this election and understand what a turning point America is at by voting in such enormous numbers already. I'm hopeful that what you say we need to do, and I agree with you, will in fact be done, and that it will be so overpowering that, be it federal troops, be it paramilitary nuts, in their camouflage uniforms, won't be able to stop the will of the people from being realized. Jeff, you and I, and others our age, have lived long enough to know that what carries the day when push really comes to shove in this country, more than electing anybody, more than trying to get a piece of legislation through, is mobilization of the people in the streets determined to see the right outcome, whether it was the end of the war in Vietnam, the end of Jim Crow in the South, whatever it might be. What you just pointed to with Black Lives Matter, historic numbers of people in the streets. So I have a certain confidence, and that we will not be afraid of it. We will welcome the opportunity to say to the president and those who would exercise a coup with him, it will not be done on our watch. It just will not be done on our watch.
I agree. In fact, I don't think the ruling class of the United States would accept that.
That's a good point.
We're in such a situation that this, and I say moron president, and it's not my words, it's former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who's the head of ExxonMobil and became Trump's Secretary of State, literally called Trump an effing moron. At the time, Trump proposed a 100-fold increase in tactical nuclear weapons. So when you see the president of the United States running around in the middle of a pandemic today, saying that the COVID-19 is no longer a threat, we have it under control, when we have 75,000 people a day becoming ill, and a perspective of 500,000 by February, and the president doesn't seem to recognize that. I think he's out of sync, not only with the American people, but with his own ruling class that doesn't need a nutcase, narcissistic, extreme egomaniac in office. They would prefer to rule through Biden, doing the same thing Trump does economically, but with a smile on one's face. In any case, here's the point. When Trump was walking down the street in Washington across Lafayette Park, Bible in hand, accompanied by his chief of staff, Mark Milley, the Joint Chief of Staff head, the biggest military general in the country, and his Secretary of Defense accompanying him, it was a matter of days that both of them repudiated having participated. His own staff repudiated him. And they said, the last thing we need to do is call out troops to repress peaceful demonstrators. Trump says they're violent protesters. He characterizes Black Lives Matter as extremists, including in his recent debate with Biden. Is it possible that we are dealing with a nutcase president, literally, who the powers that be thought that they could control? I mean, after all, they had a bodybuilder like Arnold Schwarzenegger become governor. They had a wrestler like Jesse Ventura become governor. They thought they could put up with Trump, but I don't think so anymore. And in the face of the mobilizations we need, I think they're all going to make sure that Trump exits peacefully, but I can't bet on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And that's why, although I think Trump will try to pull out the troops, as he's already indicated in the face of the protest, I'm not 100% confident that the troops will answer that call. There's been a lot of indication from top generals that they don't intend to play a role in the outcome of the election. And it certainly could be argued without any reach that to come out into the streets when people are protesting an election being stolen in front of the whole world is not the time for the military to get involved unless they be accused of being pivotal in the outcome of the election. So I think you've got that going for you. And I think you're also right, Jeff, and it's an important point about the ruling elite. They've already got their corporate autocracy, and the corporate oligarchy, if you will, that runs the country. And they were happy with Trump as long as he could kind of get away with his grifting and not do much harm to them and their respect from the public. But the public has figured it out. It's taken 4 years. And sadly, there are still all too many Americans who buy into whatever the crap is he sells. But enough people, I hope and believe, certainly if we can have a fair election, I think it'll show it, have come to realize what a con man he is, what a maniac what he is, what a narcissist he is, and how much harm he's done to the country, not only domestically, but internationally. So I think Trump may be betting on having a lot of friends in the corporate world and in the military world that in fact he does not have anymore, who aren't prepared at least to take this leap on his behalf.
With regard to our kind of politics, Jim, I don't ever recall a time in my life when we used words that had a personal connotation. When we say that he's an egomaniac, a narcissist, a moron, and so on. And yet not a day passes when those labels don't apply. Not that is, we have someone in office who is an embarrassment even to the ruling rich that run the country. They don't want an unsophisticated guy running around without a mask, polluting everybody in the White House and speaking to mass crowds and bringing on crowds that become super spreaders. They're embarrassed with this guy. But I no longer feel the restraint of saying you can't call him a moron because he, in fact, is so infatuated with himself and his sense of power and his belief that the military will come out to crush people, and his characterization of Black Lives Matter as violent when they have been the victims of violence for one lifetime, for 400 years. So I think we live in extremely troubled times. And I'll tell you, if they try to bring out federal troops, I think they're going to run into the worst nightmare that Mark Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, projected. He's worried that the majority of these young people are victims of the economic draft, Blacks, Latinos. They would prefer fraternization with the demonstrators than opening fire, than poisoning gas on them. The magnitude of the protests, in my opinion, will be massive. And yet we're 4 days away. The whole world is watching this particular election, never before. And it could bring about some unprecedented changes, the most important of which is putting a giant question mark over the validity of the system itself. Not to mention the Supreme Court, 9 judges deciding the future of the world, the future of women's rights to control their own bodies, or that hundreds of judges doing the same that Trump has appointed, or a system itself that has lost its legitimacy.
Well, if I may, Jeff, I'm sorry, on that last point, because I think that's so critically important. You and I know, I believe, agree on this, that there's not much democracy. It's not a real democracy in America anyway, for all the reasons I think anybody on this website or on this webinar would understand. Actually, one of the few good things coming out of this mess, other than getting rid of Trump, if we get rid of Trump, it has laid bare in a way that has not been laid bare as clearly before how corrupt this political system is, even if a president is not trying to effectuate a coup. I mean, the average Mary and Joe on the streets know a lot more about gerrymandering and restricting of votes and than they did before this debacle of an election came along. And hopefully, that education will not be lost on certainly it hasn't been lost on the youth of this country, and will stand us in some good stead as we try to go forward with our own political programs, demanding that we have that same kind of opportunity that the capitalists have to present our case, appeal to the people we are trying to appeal to, and ultimately change the system which has led us to this.
Jim, I want to give you the last word, but I'd like to tell our audience to check us out at socialistaction.org. That's our website. We have a list of all of our YouTube presentations so you can get an idea. You can get a subscription online to our website, and you can donate to Socialist Action and write in Jeff Mackler for president. It's a promise, Jim. If I win, you're going to share the White House with me, along with every single fighting socialist movement in America.
And
So
in the meanwhile, we'll see you in the streets.
how can we get a hold of you? What are your last words to our audience across the country? And
I want to see you in the streets. We'll see you in the streets. Wear a mask. Be safe when you have to be safe. Take care of yourselves. But this is too important. You can't leave this to your neighbor. We're all in this. We've all got to be out there fighting for what we know is right.
Jim, how can people get a hold of you and the National Lawyers Guild?
It's easy to, well, you can go online, of course. It's www.nlg-la.org. I'm at J Lafferty, Lafferty, at nlg-la.org. And either way, it'll get to me, and I'm happy to hear from folks.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us. We're honored.
Thank you.
Stay safe, and we'll see you in the streets if needed. And let's plan for it on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. Thanks. Jeff Mackler signing off.